Okay, good afternoon, welcome. Hopefully you can see the screen and you can see me. And let's begin. If you can see the screen, good. If not, um, it's fine. We'll just read out loud. What I have here open is a page from newyork.gov, which is open to COVID-19 eviction protections for tenants. And it says as follows. In 2019, 2020, there was a COVID pandemic. And during that time, the state of New York passed a law for to protect tenants. And it says as follows. The Tenant Safe Harbor Act, Chapter 127 of 2020, protects tenants from eviction for failing to pay their rent that came due during the covered period from March 7, 2020 through January 15, 2022. Basically, you have a 2-year period over here where landlords were forbidden from evicting tenants who failed to pay rent if they suffered financial hardship due to COVID-19. So now, Reuven and Shimon come to Bezdin. Reuven is a landlord. Shimon is a tenant. Shimon hasn't paid his rent in 6 months. Reuven wants to kick him out. Shimon claims, can't kick me out. There's a law. It's Dina Demalchus. Reuven says, what Dina Demalchus? We have a Shulchan Aruch. And I have an apartment or a house. It belongs to me. I'm allowed to kick you out for not paying rent. Who is right? And how do we pass it? So, in the previous year, it was before Yom Tif, we began discussing the Dina Demalchus. And to recap briefly, we mentioned that there are basically two shittas. There are a lot of shittas in Rishonim, but we've spoken generally about two shittas, how Din the Malchusa works. One is the shitta of Deran, that Din the Malchusa is effective because the land, the Malchus, belongs to the king, and he's able to enact and collect taxes and tolls and fees for living on his land and for doing business with his merchandise. And then there's a second reason, the reason of the Rashbam, which says anything that is minhagas shel mishpatei amalucha, anything that is normal for a king to enact, is binding under Dina de Malchusa because the Bnei HaMalchus, the citizens of the country, accept upon themselves the authority of the king. And based on that, we explained that based on the rationale of the Rashbam, so Din de Malchusa applies not only, it also applies to a democratic government and to our governments nowadays, but Mikol Shekain, if Din de Malchusa applies to a king who is not elected, but because he's a king, so by default, Samcha Daitam Shehu Adeineim Vehem Le'avadim, the people, the king's subjects, accept upon themselves his rulership. So Allah has Kavam Vakama, today's day and age, and tomorrow's the election day. We know that our leaders are democratically elected. So even if you didn't vote for the current president or the current government, or you don't agree with certain policies, there's a din here of Dina de Malchusa because there's a smichus das of accepting the king. Okay, so that's or of accepting the authority of the government. So that's just briefly what we discussed in the previous share. We learned in the Alter Rebbe, Sif Tesvav and Tazayin, and we learned that as a result, taxes that the king collects are legitimate, are dinah de malchusa. They're not considered stolen, they're not considered theft, and it's permitted to have hana from them. And again, we spoke on machlekes whether it's there's a heter to evade taxes. Again, That was in the previous year. Today, let's continue in Sif Yud Zayin, and we'll read through a few sifim here. There's some interesting halachas. They're not very difficult. They're not also relevant to nowadays, but at the end, from a few details that we'll pick out here and there, we'll be able to answer our main question that we began with. So Sif Yud Zayin says as follows: Melech shakaras ilana shel balei batim, ve'asa mehem gasher, king who cut down trees that belong to people. Mutter laver love. It's permitted to build a bridge. Cut down trees to build a bridge. It's permitted to cross those bridges. If there was no such thing as Dina Demalchus, so if a king comes and takes by force trees that belong to someone else, that's called Gazela. And it's usher to have hana from Gazela, so it would be usher to have hana from those bridges, it would be usher to use those bridges. But being that Dina Demalchus Dina, it is permitted to have hana from those from bridges and other things that were built by the king, even if it was built on private property or made out of private property that was taken away from citizens by force. In the United States of America, there's a law of eminent domain. In many countries, there's a law of eminent domain, which is a little bit different than what we're talking about over here. Over here, we're talking about Dina Demalchus, so the king technically has the right to take away, to reclaim whatever belongs to him, because really the whole land belongs to the king. The entire land does not belong to the government. There's a concept of private ownership, but there's a law of eminent domain, which means the government has the right to take away land if it's for the benefit of society, if the government needs it for something. In the United States, the government also has to pay. The government has to pay the fair market value, according to I believe it's the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, that the government can't just take property away. They also have to pay you for it, and then there are different interesting Supreme Court decisions about how much exactly they have to pay. But in general, the law is that they have to pay the fair market value of the property they took, and not more than that, not the what it would cost to replace it with something else. Okay, that's a separate discussion. So all of this is to say that it's not so different nowadays. If it wasn't for Dina Demalchus, it would be a little bit more complicated, if at all possible, to find a heter to drive on the road that was built on private property. There are a lot of public property was purchased through eminent domain or through the government exercising its right to take property away from private citizens. So if not for Dina Demalchus, it would be Gzela. But being that there is such a thing as Dina Demalchus, so there's no problem with that. Okay. So continues the Alter Rebbe, Afilu tziva lichreis mikol echad ve'echad davar yadua. Even if the king said, I need to cut down 250 trees and cut down 10 trees from each person. And and the shluchim of the king, the king's representatives, the king's servants went and they just cut down all the trees from the same person. Made things much easier for themselves. Still mutter. Because the shliach of the king is a king. The shluchim of the king are like the king. The king is not obligated to go around to every single person. The king is allowed to come and take whatever he wants from whoever he wants. King was nice enough to say, "Don't take it all from one person." The shluchim don't have to listen to that. They're allowed to make it easier on themselves. If you don't want to do that, then you have to arrange between yourselves. To collect the trees or whatever it is, so that the king doesn't have to take it all away from one person. Or again, between yourselves, the citizens between themselves have to work it out. But if there's no tightness to the king or to the king's shluchim for not doing it that way. But if people came and cut down trees, not in the king's name or by the king's command, and they made a bridge. Asr laver love. It's asr to cross that bridge. Unless the bridge was transferred into the ownership of the public after the original owner is already the spirit of ever getting it back, because Yeyush and Shinei Rishus creates a kinyan, so then the ownership is transferred. It's no longer considered stolen. Again, in the case of Yeyush and Shinei Rishus, the Gazlan still has a chiyuv to pay back, but as far as having hana from the stolen object, it's permitted to have hana from the stolen object because it's a new thing now. Because when the bridge is transferred to the public, so then by walking on the bridge, the public takes ownership of the bridge, the Mikah Chazaka. Okay. Sifit Ches. Chen Melech Shaharas Batim, V'asa Chayma Idarach Mutalahanas Pasotu, a king demolished homes and built a wall. It's it's mutter to have hana from that. One of the issues when Trump wanted to build a wall was that part of the border goes through private property, and again, the government has the right of eminent domain to take that land to build a wall, but it's not so simple. It takes time or whatever. That was one of the obstacles, and obviously it never ended up happening yet. Okay, so and so to anything like that, the king does something. The king takes trees, takes property, takes homes, whatever. It's mutter to have enough from it because Dina, Demalchus Dina, it's not considered Gazela, it's considered din, it's legit. This is all on condition that this is a king whose currency is legal tender in that country. Because if a king's currency is legal tender, that means that because if the citizens of the country are using a legal tender that has this king's face on it, so that means that they accepted upon themselves the authority, the rule of this king, and therefore Dina Demalchus Dina is effective. But if it's not a king, it's not a legitimate king who has a currency in his name. He's just a person who calls himself a king. So then he's a Gazlan Balzariah, a very strong Gazlan, a very powerful Gazlan, but a Gazlan nonetheless. Because Avadim Gazlanim, and everyone who works for him is also a Gazlan. So therefore, there's no Din Demalchus in such a case, but a legitimate government, a legitimate king who makes legitimate laws. So then those are considered Dina Demalchus. Sif Yudtes. V'chein melech shekoas al echad me'avada v'shamashav mebnei medina v'lokach beisi. So too, if a king became angry at one of his servants, one of his subjects, and took away his house, ein gazel. It's not considered gzeila umuter lehanis bay, and it's mutter to have hana to derive benefit from this confiscated property, and to purchase it from the king or from someone else who the king gave it to. Shakein mishpat hamelachim. Important words here. Shakein mishpat hamelachim kulam. This is the right of kings, and this is how they translate it here as it's the right of kings, but it's more than the right of kings. It's the law. It's a mishpat. It's canonized. It's something that is established as a law. To take that if you did something against the king, then the law is the king takes away your house. Why is it important to emphasize this? We'll see because we'll see in a minute why this emphasis is important. So too, if the king decrees that if a person does a certain crime, violates a certain law of the king, so we take away his property, it's not considered gazel. And it's mutter to take it and to have hana from it. B'davar klali shegazar al kol b'nei malchusay. When does all this apply? If it's a general thing that applies to kol b'nei malchusay, to all the members of to all the citizens of the country. But if the king makes a law that's specific to one person, specifically you have to pay 10 times more taxes than everyone else. Specifically, you have to give him your house. Why stop? Or even on one state or one region of his country, and he changes them. So then it's already not Dina Demalchus. If the law has exceptions that apply only to a specific person, then then everything that he takes away from them is Gzela. And it's forbidden to have an from it unless you have the conditions that we mentioned earlier. But since he does not apply his laws in a fair way, in a uniform way. This is not called Dina Demalchus. The place can say it's called Gazlanusa Demalchus. Gazlanusa Demalchus is not Din. Only Dina Demalchusa is Din. That's why it was important to emphasize earlier that when it says when a king takes away something from why is taking if the beginning of the sif was if the king gets upset at one of his servants and takes something away from them, that's fine. But now we're saying that if it's something that's specific to one person, it's not Din Demalchusa, it's Gzela. The reason is because in that case, Shekain Mishpat HaMalachim, that's the law. That a law applies to everyone. Just like if this person did this, committed this crime, therefore the law is that the king takes away his house. The same law would apply to anyone who did that. But if the king, to begin with, the person didn't do anything to merit or to not merit special treatment, so then that's Gzela. Okay. Hopefully that's clear. When we call Makim, says the Alter Rebbe, Im Geyser ala Yehudim sheyitnu meches davar acher yoser mehanachim. If the king makes a Jew tax, creates a law that Jews specifically, you didn't have to pay more than Goyim, Nikra Mashva Midaisav, that's called Mashva Midaisav, that's not called Gzela, that's called, it's a uniform law, because all Yidden are paying the same amount, so that's called Mashva Midaisav, that's not called unfair, that's not called Gzela. Now there's an obvious question over here that right before we say if he singles out one umnus or one region, that's not called Mashva Midaisav, that's called Gzela. But if he singles out Yidden specifically, that is called Mashva Midaisav. This originally comes from the Rama, brings these two dinim in Shulchan Aruch and Siman Shin Samach Tes, and really the Rama gets it from the Marik. Achirim deal with this. The Gra already asks this question, and he leaves it as a tzarichin. It's a little bit difficult. The truth is there are some answers out there. They're difficult to understand. It is okay. We'll leave it as a stira al kapanim. This is the halacha that a Jew tax, if he singles out Yidden, that's called mashva midaisav, that's called Gzela. But if he singles out a specific person or even a specific region, that's not called mashva midaisav. Some Acharonim point out that really it's a fairish Gemara, that the Gemara says that different there are halachas if you're allowed to wear kilayim. Climb the Rabbonim in order to evade the tax. So you see clearly that there's a tax there that singles out people who wear kilayim or don't wear kilayim. So it's obviously singling out Yidden. In any case, this is the halach. And now here, and also everything else that we mentioned until now, all these cases, really of the first two sifim Yudzayin and Yiches of cutting down the trees and cutting down, taking away houses to build a wall. It's all basically Ferish Gemara and Bava Kama of Kufid Gimel. The Rambam brings it, and this is also brought in Shulchan Aruch in Siman Shin Samach Tes. Now, at the end of Sifit Tes, there's a very, very important Nakuda, which is hopefully going to help us understand some questions and some scenarios that are very relevant nowadays. Even when a king applies his decrees uniformly. Ein Dina din ela bedavar sheyesh bay hana ala melech. The Dina Demalchus only applies to things that have a hana ala melech, that bring a hana to the king. Or something that is for the benefit of the entire country. But not by personal disputes between bin adam lachaveri. Not by something that's between one person and another person. Because if you say that Dina de Malchusa applies to davar prati that's bin adam lachaveri, then you can take the entire Shulchan Aruch.
We have six. Right now they're putting in three, so they don't. So
I'd like to have.
Sorry about that. If Dina de Malchusa applies to any personal dispute, so then you're bitalta Dina Atayra. You are. There's no shulchan, the whole chesed mishpat. You take chesed mishpat, throw it in the garbage, put it in shemus, and instead we study the U.S. code because there's no Dina de Malchusa, so it doesn't matter what it says in Shulchan Aruch. Obviously, we can't say that. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. Let's try to go in order. This din that by davar prati shebein adam lachaveri, that you don't say when you don't say din of the malchusa she'im loikein bitalta din atera chas v'shalom, it comes from the Rama in Siman Shin Samach Tes, and the Alter Rebbe adds a few words here that clarify the Rama's shita, because the Rama is not completely clear, and Achreinim say they struggle with it, but they present. You see in Achreinim that they present different ways of understanding the Rama, but really it's not so pashat already. The Smeh, okay, like this. The example that the Rama brings over there in Siman Shin Samach Tes is as follows. According to halacha, when a woman gets married, if the married woman dies, her husband is Yerisher. Her husband inherits her belongings. That's halacha in Shulchan Aruch in Even Ezer. What if there's a law that the din de malchusa, when a woman dies, her family inherits her belongings? So can the family claim when you got married, there's a din de malchusa, and din de malchusa means you got married on condition that that when she dies, the husband is not going to inherit her, rather her family is going to inherit her. Says the Rama, no, you don't say that, because we have a Shulchan Aruch for this. We don't need Dina de Malchus to tell you who inherits a woman after she dies. We have a Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch says her husband inherits her. The family can't claim that, the Dina de Malchus, that the family inherits her. Sheim loikein betalta Dina Yater Chas V'Shalom. However, the Rama himself, elsewhere in Shulchan Aruch, famous machlekas, the Rama and the Shach, because the Rama says as follows. The Rama says, when one person lends another person money, let's say Reuven lends money to Shimon. So Shimon gives Reuven a mashkin, something to use as a collateral for a loan. What's the point of the collateral? The point of the collateral is you don't pay me back, I'm going to sell it and take the money in repayment of my loan. Now, according to halacha, stam alva shleish yemim. And if I'm not paid back in 30 days, after 30 days, I can sell it. Says the Rama, in the place where the law is, where the Dina de Malchusa is, that you can only sell a mashkin after a year, you're only allowed to sell it after a year. Dina de Malchusa Dina. Okay. Comes along the Shach, and at great length and very sharply argues with the Rama. He says, Chalila leitei kaseis b'Yisrael, a few times like that or similar lashon. Chalila leitei kaseis b'Yisrael. Where's the Rama get this from? That there's such a thing that when there's a Dina Demalchus against what it says in Shulchan Aruch, that we go with Dina Demalchus. It's not what Dina Demalchus is for. Dina Demalchus is only for things that are for the king. For Hanas HaMelech, the king charges taxes. So Dina Demalchus Dina. Again, Dina Demalchus Dina says in Gemara. Nobody argues. No, it's a stam Gemara that nobody argues with. Nobody argues with it. Statement of Shmuel. So says the Shach. What's Dina Demalchus? Things are for Hanas HaMelech. But things that are bein adam lachaver, between two people, we have a Shulchan Aruch for this. We have a whole Cheshire Mishpat. So the Shach answers his own question. The Rama is going l'shitasi. The Rama in Siman Shin Samachtas says that not only things are for Hanas HaMelech, but things are for Takanas Bnei HaMedina, or like the Alter Rebbe says over here, Tikkun HaMedina Kula. Things that are for Tikkun HaMedina are also included in Dina Demalchus. So we must say, says the Shach, that this law about selling a mashkin after a year is also Takanas Kol Bnei HaMedina for Tikkun HaMedina Kula. So the Shach says that's the Rama's Shitta, but Hagufa Kasha. Where do you get this from? Who says it's something that Tikkun, even if it's Tikkun Bnei HaMedina Kula? We don't say Dina Demalchus, and that's how the Shach holds. Now the Rama doesn't hold like this. And the Rama says that anything that is not only Takanas HaMelech or Takanas Bnei HaMedina is included in Din Demalchus. And the Alter Rebbe here is bringing the Rama, and he explains about what does this come to exclude? What's the difference between the case of the loan of the mashkin that you can only sell after 12 months, and the case of the Yerusha, where we don't follow Din Demalchus, we follow Shulchan Aruch, but because only by something that's Takanas Bnei HaMedina, for Takana of all Bnei HaMedina, but not for a Davar Prati Shebein Adam Lachaver. So obviously, like the Shach himself says, the case of the Yerusha, the case of the Mashkin, is for Takanas Bnei HaMedina. It's something that benefits everyone in the country equally. Something that is a private thing between two people, then we don't say Dina Demalchus. Now, the Shach already points out the difficulty in this, that says, Mi Mephis, who can determine, who can say this is benefits everyone, this only benefits certain people. So in practice, it's very hard to figure out how exactly to apply this. But the theory of it is like this. Something like the Rama says, that's when does to summarize, when does Dina Demalchus apply according to the Rama and the way the Alter Rebbe is bringing it down? Something that is either Takanas HaMelech, Hanas HaMelech, benefits the king, benefits the government, or Takanas Bnei HaMedina, or benefits everyone in the country, but not something that is that is private between two people. Davar Prati Shebein Adam Lachaver. The Shach says only things that are for for Hanas HaMelech are under Din Demalchus. Everything else is not included in Din Demalchus. So now let's again think of some practical examples. Traffic laws. Traffic laws, speeding, stopping at red lights, whatever, you name it, is something that's obvious. I don't think it's possible to debate this, that it's something that's Takanas Kol Bnei HaMedina Kula. Everybody is interested in having a safe driving environment on the road, and that if there were no laws, that would be crazy, and everybody's interested in that. So somebody gets a ticket, Pashtus, and I haven't seen anyone who disagrees with this. All today's Acharim say that you're obligated to pay. The truth is that some in the Shevet Halevi in Shal Chuvas and Chelak Yud Simir Sadak Aleph, he says he goes further. He says it has nothing to do with Dina Demalchus Dina. Dina Demalchus Dina is something that whatever, a law that whatever, we can debate what Din Demalchus Dina means and what's included in Din Demalchus, but something that is so simple, it's so obvious. He says this is not Cheshen Mish, but this is pretty obvious. Have a misfal b'shleim shel malchus shel if you don't have a government that's in charge of making sure that society is able to function normally, so I don't need Din Demalchus for that. Okay, but even if you don't, even if you don't accept that, for sure it's Din Demalchus. This is something that's for takanas kol bnei Medina kula. Other things, establishing normal working conditions and prices for certain products. Somebody asked me once about building, renovating his house. He wanted to make his basement, make guest rooms, but you could do it, but according to the law, you need to get permits in order to build. So how does it work within the Malchusa? Bepashtus. The reason why why the law requires you to have permits in order to build is for safety. Because if people are able to do whatever, it's not going to be safe. You have to make sure that your construction is up to code and it's following safety procedures. So that is something that would be takonas b'nei Medina, that according to the Rama and according to the Alter Rebbe would be included under Dina Demalchus, and I'm not sure what the heter is to build without obtaining proper permits, or if there is a heter at all. So again, to summarize, and I don't think we're running out of time to answer the question we started off with, so we'll have to leave it as cliffhanger for next week. But in summary, Dina Demalchus applies to all laws, not necessarily laws that have to do with taxes or things that directly benefit the king or have to do with the land. The Rama, forgot to mention earlier, the Rama brings a machlikas about this. The Rama brings a machlikas that some Rishonim will say the Demalchus only applies to laws that have to do with the land, but something that doesn't have to do with the karka, with the land, there's no Dina Demalchus. And the Rama brings that there are other opinions who argue, and the Rama says the halacha is that it applies to all laws. And again, we understand, like we mentioned, that the way the Rashbam explains it, kol minhagis mishpetei amalucha, nothing that doesn't have to do specifically with the land, with the karka. So we say Dina Demalchus. The Alter Rebbe doesn't even get into this chiluk because the halacha is like the Rama. The Rama says that it applies to all laws, but it has to be it has to be a law that applies to everyone equally. Can't be something that applies to some people more than to others. Okay, there's an exception of if the king singles out Yidden for whatever reason, but otherwise it does not apply, and if and such a law is considered Gazela. Then Dina Demalchus applies if it's either for Hanas HaMelech, if it benefits the government, benefits the king, or it's Takanas Bnei HaMedina, something that applies equally for the equal benefit of all the citizens in the country. However, davar prati sheben adam lachaveri, a personal dispute between two people, that is something that we have to follow Shulchan Aruch, and we don't say Dina Demalchus, and a person who would lose a din Torah according to halacha, but would win, let's say, according to Dina Demalchus, cannot claim Dina Demalchus because of davar prati sheben adam lachaveri. As we mentioned, it may be difficult to determine what is exactly something that is called takanas kol bnei Medina kula, and what is something that's a davar prati. But in any case, if it's difficult to define, so then it's difficult to collect it in Bezdin. And And then we started off with Shaila about rent control and tenant protection laws, which requires a little bit more of an arichos, so we're going to have to wrap that up next week. One more point before we conclude is that it's important to point out that even in situations where we would follow Dina Demalchus, still have to go to Bezdin. It's not a heter to go to court. There's a very serious issue of going to Arkais, of going to a secular court, and Din Demalchus means that the Bezdin can paskin based on Din Demalchus, but not that there's a heter to go and take this dintera to a secular court. And with that, we'll end here for today. And Be'ezras Hashem, the next year, probably next week, we will pick this back up and continue, and hopefully wrap up our discussion of Din Demalchus.